Hello and welcome to Spotlight. A spokesman for the Iranian Armed Forces has warned the U.S. over its rhetoric against the Islamic Republic. During his talks with Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid, U.S. President Joe Biden said he's prepared to use force against Iran over its nuclear program. In response, Iran has called on Washington to review its own previous failures in the region. The U.S. president arrived in Tel Aviv on Wednesday at the beginning of his four-day visit to West Asia. Biden also met with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in the occupied West Bank. But Palestinians have met Biden's visit with skepticism, saying that he's ignoring their right to self-determination and Israeli settlement building. Joe Biden is now visiting Saudi Arabia on the last leg of his West Asia tour amid bipartisan criticism back home over human rights issues and the 2018 killing of dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi agents in Turkey. Joining us on tonight's Spotlight, we have activist from the Answer Coalition, Richard Becker, who's joining us from San Francisco. And also we have Mr. Khalid Barakat, journalist and activist, joining us from Vancouver. Well, gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Richard Becker in San Francisco. Mr. Becker, how would you describe the overall aim of this trip?
Well, I think that this trip is part and parcel of neocon foreign policy that the Biden administration is pursuing. And if you look at the people in the Biden administration, from the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to Secretary of State Tony Blinken, to the person in charge of Euro-Asia Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and you can just go down the line. This is a foreign policy team that is back from the Obama administration, from when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and when Joe Biden was the Vice President of the United States. And so they've assembled they've reassembled this team, and they are pursuing an extremely aggressive and extremely dangerous foreign policy. But particularly in regard to this trip, you see that Biden and his advisors are collaborating with the apartheid regime in Israel and its leaders, with a regime in Saudi Arabia, which has never had an election in its entire history. So I say that because when we hear the talk about human rights coming out of the mouths of the same people that I just described, we have to know that it's pure hypocrisy and pure propaganda when they can befriend Saudi Arabia, which is one of, if not the most repressive regime in the entire world, where there's never been an election and where people are regularly beheaded in public. And so this is for the interest of imperialism, it's for the interest of power and profit, but it has nothing to do with the interest of the people there or the people here.
Right. Khalid Barakat, let's talk about the security pact with Israel, the so-called Jerusalem Declaration, further outlining Washington's support for the Israeli regime. Palestinian resistance group Hamas has reacted to that pact, saying that the U.S. is now complicit in the crimes against Palestinians, and the U.S. is seeking to liquidate the Palestinian cause by integrating Israel into Arab and Islamic culture. Do you think that's what the United States is aiming for, and can it be successful in that regard, given the grassroots rejection that we've seen to the likes of the normalization deals with the Israeli regime?
Yes, I mean, the U.S. is interested in its interest, and Israel is a strategic asset for the United States, and also the subcontractors and the Arab reactionary regimes and their allies. And so this trip and this pact, the security pact with Israel, comes in order to ensure Israel and their new Arab allies that the United States is going to be present, and it's going to protect you, and it's going to support you. And this is in an attempt to build on Trump policies. I mean, if you read the declaration, it's absolutely word for word of what Trump and Netanyahu would draft. Nothing changed in terms of U.S. policies in the region between Trump and Biden. In fact, the whole rotten deal of Abraham Accord, the so-called Abraham Accord was mentioned. This is really shows in a way a hidden crisis that the United States and Israel and their allies in the region are living. They're trying to export their crisis by picking up, a fight with Iran. I mean, public and media fight with Iran, and that's because we saw what Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah speech, his last speech, and maybe we'll get to that later. But his speech actually provided analysis that has widely been supported in the Arab world just a couple of days ago when he said that Biden is here because Biden wants more oil. He's looking at his crisis and the crisis in Ukraine and Russia, and he wants to ensure Israel that the United States is present. This is really what's all this visit about, and it's going to fail just like previous visits. I mean, it's really not finding any support, even by some Arab states.
Richard Becker, Washington and the Israelis have plans to build a regional security alliance to fight off the, quote, threat of Iran. Iran has responded to these calls, stressing that, first of all, regional security cannot be imported, and that Israel is, in fact, the reason for any insecurity in the region. Walk us through these comments, and do you believe that the likes of the Israelis are really after stability in the region? Because their actions have proven the opposite.
Well, the Israeli leaders want to be the dominant power in the region, as the subcontractors, as Khalid Barakat said, as the subcontractors for the U.S. So they have congruent interests. But whether or not they can actually achieve what they're trying to achieve, I think, is highly doubtful. That the idea and the point about Iran being in the region, it is in the region. The United States is in the region only by virtue of its military forces that are heavily deployed there. But the idea of the Abraham Accords is really brings into the light fully what the left in the Arab world, the progressives in the Arab world, have said for a very long time, is that it's not just Israel, it's not just Israel and the United States, it's Israel, the United States, and the reactionary Arab regimes that are the enemies of the Palestinian people, and really the enemies of the people of the entire region. The people, the average person in regimes like Egypt, for instance, or in Saudi Arabia, or the guest workers, who are the vast majority of the population in the United Arab Emirates, they are suffering under this policy. They are suffering terribly. We have in Qatar the World Cup coming up. We don't know how many hundreds of thousands of immigrant workers have died and suffer under the most terrible conditions to build the stadiums for that and to do all of the manual labor. Only 11% of the UAE's population, for instance, is citizens, and the 89% who are the foreign workers, the so-called guest workers, although many of them are there for their lives and generations, they are denied all rights. So how can that create stability? It can't. It means that there's a constant struggle that's going on. And what the U.S. is trying to do now, together with Israel, with the Saudi leaders, with the UAE leaders, who are also carrying out this terrible war in Yemen, what they're trying to do is solidify their position, but they can't really do it because it's inherently unstable.
Mr. Barakat, in Vancouver, it's quite evident that there's an ongoing anti-Iran campaign spearheaded by the U.S. and its main ally, Israel. U.S. President Joe Biden said he's prepared to use force against Iran over its nuclear program. Well, Biden himself has admitted many times that this so-called maximum pressure campaign against Iran has failed. Why is he still walking in the footsteps of the previous administration?
This is just rhetoric by Biden, and I agree with everything that Richard said in terms of the analysis of the camp that is leading this war or war mongering against Iran. These campaigns, it's not just the United States; it's the same camp, Israel and the Arab Reaction Regime. And the reason they're doing this is because they are not exactly having the upper hand. We know, and the world knows, that Iran is a regional power that has a present and an influence in the entire region and the world. And they have to sit with Iran as a major force. They cannot ignore Iran. Iran is not a force that the United States can just put aside. Iran has a deep depth in the region, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world. Israel is the fake regime that the West created in our region, not Iran. And the United States is a colonizer in the region and not Iran. And the people of Iran are trying to develop their economic and their strength as a people, and that's their right. No one can argue that Iran has no right to build its nuclear facilities, its economy. And this siege against Iran, it's very similar to the siege that the United States is imposing on Palestinians in Gaza, very similar to the siege imposed on our people in Lebanon. I mean, the people of Lebanon are being pushed into starvation. And sometimes they justify this because of, the resistance in Lebanon and Iran policies, when everyone knows, including in Lebanon, that Iran is not trying to do anything in Lebanon but helping the people of Lebanon to actually come out from their economic and social crisis.
Right.
And so, this is a war against the people of the region, and because Iran, it's spearheading the camp of resistance in the region, they want to target Iran. But I think that the United States is too weak to do that because they need to spend money on education and food in the United States. Millions of Americans are actually hungry, and they need that money, not war. Money should go for education.
Richard Becker, pursuing this policy of spreading Iranophobia, the U.S. and Israel maintain the accusation that Iran is seeking nuclear weapons. Now, one of the main points of the JCPOA was for Iran to show that it does not want nuclear weapons. But the U.S. left that agreement, and then it went back to insisting that Iran is in pursuit of nuclear weapons. It seems like the U.S. is looking more for excuses rather than solutions. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, as I said before, I think that this is a warmongering regime in Washington, a highly dangerous, highly aggressive regime. You can see that they provoked the war in the Ukraine-Russia war most deliberately. They refused to negotiate, absolutely refused to negotiate. In fact, their response to Russia's position, official position, in a letter that was sent back in December was no, 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 no. And in other words, no negotiation. Now, in regard to Iran and the JCPOA, which the United States government, the Trump administration, but the United States government unilaterally broke, now they're insisting that there must be new concessions from Iran in order for the JCPOA to be reinstated, which makes it highly doubtful, according to all media reports, although it's not for certain, but highly doubtful that any agreement can be reached, because this is not negotiating in good faith at all. This is taking a position that Iran, which made very significant concessions in order for the JCPOA to be culminated, are now being demanded that they make more and more and more concessions. And it's clear that the Iranian government is unwilling to do that. So when the U.S. threatens military power, military threat, makes a military threat against Iran, you know, we have to see that in conjunction with the refusal to negotiate in good faith.
All right, gentlemen, let's pause for a second and have a look at this. Here's a video from a young and vibrant Senator Joe Biden from back in 1986. Let's run that.